Yes, hello. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are. On behalf of the organizers, I would like to warmly welcome all of you and thank you for joining us to this event today. My name is Lola Garcia Lix, and I am the Senior Advisor on Global Governance in the International Workgroup for Indigenous Affairs, which together with Indigenous Peoples' Rights International, we are the organizers of the event today. But I will pass the floor to Pavel Sulansiga, which will be my co-facilitator of this event. Pavel, over to you.
Good morning, good day, good evening. I would like to welcome all of you. Thank you very much. I'm very honored and pleased to welcome all of you at this important meeting today. This meeting is dedicated to questions, issues of indigenous peoples and business. And first of all, I would like to mention the person who gave impetus to a very important process of John Wright. We all know John as a very good philosopher and a very good person who was at the very start of this process of guiding principles. And we will talk about it today in our everyday conversation. We call them guiding principles. And at this time, it was a very big achievement of our community and the humankind at different levels, political, international, etc., concerning human rights and businesses. This helped us and many people to understand better the issues of indigenous peoples. But nevertheless, indigenous peoples continue to suffer human rights abuses at their traditional territories and lands. And I would like at this relation to point out the status, exceptional status of human rights indigenous defenders, because these people defend their people's rights. And I would like to seize this occasion because many persons from UN system take part in our meeting. I would like to draw their attention to these many issues of indigenous people's rights, so that those issues would be included in the roadmap for the next decade of implementation of the United Nations Guiding Principles. We are now reviewing this document. This process is on the way in many countries and international organizations. I would like once again thank all our participants, all those who joined us, our speakers, experts in particular. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pavel. I have very little to add of what you said and the background of the meeting, but I think it's important to mention that this side event is organized in the margins of the 48th session of the Human Rights Council. And this session, the September session of the Human Rights Council, is particularly important for indigenous peoples and for the recognition protection of their rights, as the Council considers the reports of the Special Rapporteur and the reports of the expert mechanism. And at the same time, also there is the annual resolution on the rights of indigenous peoples. So I think we very much hope also that the side event, the discussion today, the presentation of our speakers here also can contribute or is a contribution to the current discussion in the Human Rights Council, and will be of help for some of the issues regarding this resolution that is currently being negotiated and discussed among governments. Thank you very much. But with this brief introduction, we will start with the opening remarks that will be provided by the Danish ambassador, Mr. Morten Jespersen. And perhaps just to explain you a little bit how the event is being structured, we will, after the opening remarks of the ambassador, we will have 3 presentations from indigenous peoples on the ground, one from Asia, one from Africa, and one from Latin America. After that, it will be followed with a panel of 3 members of UN, of the mechanisms of the Human Rights Council, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, a representative of the Working Group on Business and Human Rights, and 1 expert member of the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. After that, we will have some remarks from Joan Carling, and it will be also a possibility after Joan's remarks for an open discussion with all participants. And we would like to end the event with a video that IPRI and IFGIA have produced on the UN Guiding Principles. So with this, I would like very much to give the floor to Morten Jespersen, which is Denmark's ambassador at the Permanent Mission of Denmark to the UN in Geneva. So Morten, the floor is yours, and thank you very much for joining us today. We are very pleased to have you with us. Please, Morten.
Thank you so much, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank IFGIA and Indigenous Peoples' Rights International for organizing this important event. Promoting and protecting the rights of indigenous peoples and fostering business respect for human rights are 2 key priorities for Denmark, not least during our membership of the Human Rights Council. And the 2 are closely linked. Indigenous peoples continue to be among the groups most affected by the adverse human rights impact of business activities. And indigenous human rights defenders continue to be among those most at risk of reprisals and violence. In 2011, the guiding principles on business and human rights were endorsed as the consensual global framework to promote the effective prevention of business-related human rights harm and remedy for the victims, including indigenous peoples. As we pursue broader and deeper implementation of the guidelines in the next decade, we need to ensure full, equal, and meaningful participation of indigenous peoples in discussions and decisions. In the same way that we need to ensure the participation of indigenous peoples on all issues affecting them. Hopefully, we will see the establishment of more effective mechanisms to prevent and remedy business-related human rights abuses. EU legislation requiring companies to adopt due diligence measures in their chain will be an important step forward, we believe, and of course, with the full support from Denmark to these new measures. Also, the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct remain an important framework. Is one small but important step towards enhanced protection of and respect for the rights of indigenous peoples in the context of business activities. I wish you all fruitful discussions during the afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much, Morten, Ambassador. I think you, in your very short remarks, I think you mentioned already some very, very important issues that we hope we will go further with during our discussions here today. And particularly, and I think we will see the need for more effective mechanisms for effective remedy, as you mentioned already. And I think we will see it in the presentations from indigenous representatives from the ground, and based on the lessons learned that they have had in the struggle for the protection and the rights and the access to remedy. Thank you very much, Ambassador. So I think we will start now with our first speaker and the topic of this section of the program is what are the lessons learned and the recommendations from indigenous peoples themselves, indigenous peoples on the ground, about the respect and the protection of their rights in the context of business activities in their lands and territories. Our first speaker is an indigenous woman from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Priscilla is a member of the National Alliance for Support and Promotion of Indigenous and Community Heritage Areas. The presentation you can get more information about Priscilla. It will be put in the chat, but we won't use much more time to present the speakers. So welcome, Priscilla, to our event today, and great thanks for joining us and accepting to be one of our panelists. And we would very much like you to share with us what's based on your struggle for the respect of the rights of indigenous communities in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and in the context, of course, of business activities, particularly on mining activities. How are indigenous people's rights being protected or respected, or how are indigenous people's rights not being protected or respected by the state or the companies in the Democratic Republic of Congo? Over to you, Priscilla.
Okay, merci beaucoup. Bonjour à tous.
Hello, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Just as it has been said by our moderator of this session, I am Priscilla Monnery, and I am from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and I will be talking about our experience. We actually were asked to talk about the rights of the indigenous peoples and how these rights are respected or not by the state and by the mining companies. I believe that with this question, we still have this difficulty, this challenge, this problem, first of all, because as you already know it, just as you know it, we depend on this lands for our survival. So we are basically being chased from our lands, delocalized from our lands. And this is part of the relocalization process. And basically, it really affects the life of the indigenous peoples of the Democratic Republic of Congo. First of all, people were in the east of the countries, they were moving there, and it actually became a source of important conflicts. And beyond all of this, we are also facing a huge pressure in our usual areas of life. And in this land, we actually have a lot of very precious and important minerals, and this is why we're facing this important pressure. There is not enough legal dispositions and regulations are not protecting us enough, and there is not enough promotion for letting people know all of this information. So basically, the problem is still present within our community. So what are we doing right now as organizations of civil society? We are thinking about how we can grant, because we have all this important measures that have been expressed in 2018, but we have been thinking about how we can bridge the gaps in terms of this delocalization of people and resettling of the communities of indigenous peoples. And we also have another important challenge here, because all the different measures of implementation of these laws are not really valid in practice, which is why when we look at the initial situation, the existence of this new law doesn't really change a lot of things. And at the same time, we are trying to see what can be done in order to reinverse this trend, and we are basing our activities on all the experiences that we can see in our country. We have already started thinking about it with the process of the community forestry and how we can protect the rights of this particular community living and depending on the forest. But at the same time, we have seen that we are talking about a very important area which is occupied by these companies that are doing mining there. So we are basically doing this campaign right now. We would like to have the measures not only adopted, but also followed in practice. And we also want the code and the laws to be revised in order to include the rights of the indigenous peoples. We would like also to have the monitoring, the follow-up, and the surveillance in terms of the application of the rights of the indigenous peoples while doing all the mining activities. And finally, we're also suggesting to implement and to organize local committees that will be in charge of the rights of indigenous peoples and of the development, because we understand that where there are a lot of interests, there is an increased poverty as well. And it is very often the case where the mining companies are present on this land. So this is basically the situation that we are living right now for the indigenous peoples, but also for Ituri, North-Kivu, Itatanga, and the province of Latiopu. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Priscilla, and thank you very much for your presentations and sharing your experiences with us. I think the whole issue of not only adopting measures on laws, but its implementation. We have the same with the international, with the UN guiding principles. They are very good, they are there, but the gaps with regard to its implementation, the gaps in relation how to make sure that they are a real effective tool for protection and respect of indigenous people's rights. I think the gaps of implementation from words, from paper to action is a key issue for all indigenous peoples in the world. I hope we can discuss further that perhaps in the debate, but considering the time, I will go ahead with our second speaker. I'm very pleased to have here with us Rica Sambolingi from Indonesia. Rica is the Secretary General of the Indigenous Peoples Alliance of the Archipelago, AMAN, the world's largest indigenous peoples organization at the national level. Rica, welcome and thank you very much for being with us today. Rica, the question to you would be if you could share with us some of the key lessons learned in terms of indigenous peoples' local struggles in Indonesia with regard to the palm oil expansion in the country. And in this context, have you, the state or the companies, used the respect, protect and remedy framework? Has it been used or not used? Is it a tool that you have used also in your struggles or not? Just if you can share some of your experiences with us. Over to you, Rica.
Thank you very much, Bongi Melo. Selamat malam, good evening from Indonesia. Thank you for IPRI and IPRI me myself as a board actually member of IPRI. And thank you for this opportunity. I think especially for us Indonesia now, it's a very critical situations where when we're speaking about 1 decade of the guiding principle of business and human rights, but we are facing so much of the regress in Indonesia. Yeah, the rollback of the situations of indigenous peoples in Indonesia with regards to corporations. And this is also including on the oil palm plantations. I actually have a presentation, very brief, that I wanted to show some cases, what is going on the ground at the moment. And excuse me if I will just want to share some of these. And in fact, that the situation is not getting better; it is worsening actually. What is happening is, we all know the Indonesian government is they fought for adoption of the UNRIP, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and our rights as indigenous peoples are respected. Our inherent right, collective rights, is respected and recognized by the UN, by the declarations of Indonesia and also the constitutions, very specific on indigenous peoples. But the problem is, until today, there is no laws on indigenous peoples specific, so the government can have the guidance how to fulfill, protect, and promote the rights of indigenous peoples. And just recently, yes, last year, the whole year, while we are fighting the coronavirus, our member of parliament actually they were adopting 3 laws that are very much against indigenous people's law, and they call it Omnibus law on job creation, which is in total, I think in total disguise, because there's nothing about job creations. Even our brothers and sisters, the laborers, now facing great problem because of this law. And again, indigenous people's territory, for the sake of creating jobs, our land, our territories are now being invaded more and more by corporations. So this is and this is the examples of the conflicting law and also overlap of concession in Indonesia. And this is one of the examples of indigenous community in East Kalimantan, in Borneo, and the total area initially, originally is 53, nearly 54,000 hectares. But you see the concessions there. This is the mining concession. The red color, it's already taking the land so much. But then again came in the logging concessions, and then came in the they call it this is for a honey, and then protected forest, protected forest, 21,000 hectares. But again, they are on top of each other. And then lastly, finally, the remaining indigenous territory that is controlled by community is actually, if you can see this color and this color, they are only 409 hectares left, and they are actually separated. So this is the situations of the indigenous peoples, and we can see now that it's already on top of these indigenous territories, there are already all these different concessions and still unsolved until today, and people are still facing problems. With regards to oil palm plantations, although the president have issued that they're going to postpone and evaluate the existing concessions, but I think they just do some, and the rest they are actually expanding. So this is the concessions of oil palm Indonesia. You can see mainly in Borneo Island, in Sumatra, a little bit in Papua, in the west part of the West Papua, and then we still also here, we have it here also. Yeah, even in Papua, the remaining forest, they are giving up to a company. And this is the case just recently, as last year, where indigenous peoples were taken into custody, were arrested and being brought to jail. But indigenous, because of they are very strong, then the the judge had no other option but to release them. So thanks for that. And then in Papua, actually, in the province of West Papua, the region of Sorong, this is the local government who tried to help indigenous peoples, because he is indigenous persons himself. He revoked the concessions, and now he is being sued by the companies. So this is the situations now is regress. We are like stepping backward, like probably 100 times. We still don't have our indigenous peoples law adopted. So, and I think as we're talking about business and human rights in other sector, we don't see it. Also in mining sector, just yesterday, one of our indigenous leaders in North Sulawesi being killed, being shot dead by the police officer, and we still don't know the result of the postpartum, because he is still being examined, the body is still being examined by the doctor today. So that's the situation, and we still have also, including the energy now. One of the small islands in Indonesia, which is Flores, has been really chucked into different concessions. So when you ask me how this is, have we used it? We can't use it because there is no way we can use it, because we are still in the very unequal positions with the companies, with the corporations, because they are given so much protections by law and policy, while indigenous peoples, we are like completely naked. So that's the situation. So it's really imbalance, and every time we resist, they will always come. Do you have legal recognitions? Do you have certificate of your land? And of course, our ancestors, they inherit us the land, our territory. They never inherit us the legal certificate of our land. So that's the situation. That's why it is nearly impossible to use all this. Even we try to challenge one of the company owned by Malaysian company in West Kalimantan, and we couldn't. The court refused, because they say you don't have legal recognition. So that's the situations of Indonesia. This situation is worsening. I have to say that, and we are struggling even harder now, because the government also, especially during this Jokowi regime, although he sounds to be quite nice from the beginning, and in fact, Aman supported him. But what happened now after his second terms is all the promises that he said, the pledge, none of them has been fulfilled, and we are continuing the worsening situations now we are facing on the ground. And some of our friends, well, they used to be our friends, now they are no longer friends, because they are totally in favor of the regime, the President Jokowi. So that's the situation from Indonesia, but we remain in a very good spirit. We resist because we don't want to extinct. We have to be here because this is our land. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ruka. Yeah, in the previous speakers also mentioned the issue of implementation, whether measures and laws that they are not implemented. You are going a step forward or a step backward. Is the regression trend that unfortunately is not only seen in Indonesia but in many countries of the world. And the regression trend, which of course includes also increase of killings, criminalization for those indigenous activists who fight to protect their land and territories, and particularly in the context of the companies and enterprises in the country, and the power that they have that you mentioned also with regard to the implementation of any international agreement in that context, or in our context, the UN Guiding Principles on the rights of indigenous peoples. Yeah, thank you very much. But at least you end with a very strong message about resistance, and the lessons learned is that indigenous peoples have been able to resist and have been resisting for hundreds of years, centuries. So thank you very much, Ruka. And from Asia, we move to Costa Rica, to Latin America, and I have the pleasure today to have Alankay Morales from IPRI with us. And Alankay is from Costa Rica, and I think it will be very interesting to hear from him about state-owned companies and how do they somehow respect, align to the UN Guiding Principles. Alankay, in the context of renewable energy activities, and particularly about state-owned company, how is the state as a duty bearer protecting the rights of indigenous peoples in Costa Rica? Has the state provided access to remedy to the indigenous communities, as somehow it is state and they are committed in the UN Guiding Principles?
Thank
Please,
you, Lola.
Alankay, yes.
And thanks everyone who's here with us today. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Keys Hydroelectric project. This is a very, let's say, its history dates back to the 1970s. And it was an attempt of the government to build a hydroelectric dam on our largest river basin in Costa Rica. So the project went through those almost 5 decades, through different cycles and modifications and so forth. And in 2005, 2006, they decided on a location for building the dam site. And that location was within the lands of the Teribe people. And it was surrounded by 7 indigenous territories that are of 4 different indigenous peoples in the South Pacific of Costa Rica. And this was going to be a very, very large project. In the context of Central America, it would have been the largest hydroelectric dam with an installed capacity of around 2,000 megawatts of power. And also, in the initial budget was over 2,000, like $2 billion, sorry. And so the interests around this project were very large. It was being sponsored, and it was going to be built by a state-owned company called the Costa Rican Institute of Electricity. So all the state apparatus was in a way supporting the construction of the project, because it was seen in line with Costa Rica's green image of, conservation and renewable energies and so forth, but also it was seen as a way of further developing the country. The thing is that in the process, even though we had existing frameworks of Costa Rica had ratified in the 1990s ILO Convention 169, and we also even host the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in Costa Rica. The government didn't provide any mechanisms for the communities to influence in any way the project. So no consultation was undertaken. No, basically the narrative was this project has to be done because it has to be done. So there was no way out of it. So through this process, the project aggravated a lot of situations in the South Pacific of Costa Rica, particularly with regards to illegal land tenure among indigenous territories. So to give you an idea, like the project would have affected two specific territories, like flooded part of their lands. And one of these territories, it's of the Cabecar people of Chinaquicha. Their land, they hold out of the 1,000 and like 1,100 hectares of land. They are only holding 30 hectares of land, like effectively, like that's what the community owns. The rest of the land is in the hands of non-members or non-indigenous people. And the project basically started aggravating this situation because in a way it was seen by the non-members that they were illegally holding land within indigenous territories as a way of adding value to their lands or job opportunities and things like those. So the situation really got really bad. And in 2011, the former UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples did a mission. And at that time, the government decided to finally suspend the project, but to suspend until consultation was done. But basically, for like all the mechanisms in place, even we had a case brought to the Supreme Court in Costa Rica, and they said that at the current stage of the project, no consultation was needed, but already construction was happening with regards to the project. So as indigenous peoples, we didn't have any effective mechanisms here to actually enforce, because even the judiciary was not affirming the rights of indigenous peoples. And we had like all these standards in the Americas and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and so forth. So until very recently, this was back in 2018, the Costa Rican government finally decided to indefinitely suspend the construction of the project. They had already invested close to $200 million US, generated a lot of problems in the communities. And to give you like an idea of the two most recent murders of indigenous rights defenders in Costa Rica, both of them were in some way related to the issues behind the Diquís Hydroelectric Dam. One of them was very let's say, spoken about the impacts of the dam and opposing it, and the other person was dealing a lot with illegal land tenure. So the aggravation of all this situation has led to the murder of indigenous peoples in Costa Rica, the criminalization of many others, and sadly, even though let's say the project was suspended, the government has provided no remedies for any of this. And I forgot to mention, but both Sergio Rojas and Jerry Rivera, the two murdered leaders in the area, they were both protected by precautionary measures by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And basically, this was a case that we brought forward to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights because not even the judiciary in Costa Rica was protecting the rights of indigenous people. So we had no legal recourse here. So we had to move outside of our borders to try to get legal actions to protect the rights of indigenous peoples. So I'm afraid the case is not nice in the sense that the government hasn't done much other than canceling the project, but it hasn't provided any remedy for the damages that it generated, like the governance issues and the underlying problems that it aggravated. And in the process, also two of our brothers were murdered.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Alan Kai, for sharing the experience of Costa Rica. And I mean, even if the government now has stopped the project and all that, I mean, it's not enough. I think the ambassador started saying the need for effective measures to ensure remedy. And even in a situation like this, that is not only that the project has been stopped, people has been killed. I mean, the issue of the need for ensuring effective remedy and the commitment and the obligation of states to provide that remedy is crucial. Thank you very much, Alan Kai, for your presentation. So I think now we will move to the second part of the panel, to the speakers. And as I mentioned it before, we have with us three representatives of the three mechanisms of the Human Rights Council. The representative of the working group on business and human rights. We will have a video presentation, and the special rapporteur, Francisco Calisai, and an expert member of the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples. But I pass over the facilitation to Pavel now. So please, Pavel, it's over to you.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lola. And of course, I'd like to express my gratitude to our speakers who have just given presentations in our first part of the discussion. And of course, it's very hard to listen to all these cases, to all these negative cases with the killings of the indigenous peoples' leaders. But of course, we need to understand that we need to unite our efforts in order to improve the situation, the current situation that we are witnessing in various regions of the world. And today, right now, I'd like to give the floor, and I'm very happy to do so, to Anita Ramasastri. Anita is my colleague. We used to work within the working group together, and I've learned a lot from Anita. She's the professor of law and the director of the graduate program in sustainable international development at the University of Washington School of Law. From 2009 to 2012, she served as a senior advisor to the International Trade Administration of the US Department of Commerce. She's the author of numerous scholarly articles, reports focused on emerging issues in business and human rights. Anita, I give you the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning from Seattle, Washington. My name is Anita Ramasastri. I'm a current member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, and I lead our work on human rights defenders. I would like to thank the International Work Group on Indigenous Affairs and Indigenous Peoples' Rights International for the invitation to join you today. I'm sorry that the time difference does not allow me to join you in person. The working group engages in country visits and stakeholder consultations with communities and rights holders around the world. In this work over a decade, I and my colleagues have had the great honor of meeting with Indigenous communities and Indigenous defenders across the world and have heard their stories and their experiences of dealing with business-related human rights abuses connected to development projects and any number of business activities. We have emphasized in our country reports the problem and the lack of observance of free, prior, and informed consent. And we have emphasized that free, prior, and informed consent is a key part of not only international human rights, but of business and human rights and the UN guiding principles. And we continue to emphasize in our work and message that consultation is not the same thing as consent. Unfortunately, we have seen that there are great risks to Indigenous human rights defenders as they work to protect the rights of their communities and to stand up for the rights of all with respect to land, natural resources, and the healthy environment. Now, the business-related human rights abuses faced by human rights defenders can be the most serious of all, leading to death and serious personal injury. The working group issued guidance to the 47th session of the Human Rights Council in June, entitled The Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, Guidance on Ensuring Respect for Human Rights Defenders. This guidance was really meant to set clear expectations and provide recommendations to states or governments, as well as to business, about how to ensure respect and security of human rights defenders as critical stakeholders and people who can voice the concerns of the many about the negative impacts of business activities on the ground. Now, in its guidance, the working group highlighted that business enterprises need proactive engagement with human rights defenders, including Indigenous defenders, in line with the preventative approach outlined in the guiding principles. Now, our departure in the guidance really focuses on the fact that Indigenous defenders in particular are under increasing threat and risk. We, of course, mentioned the unfortunate and horrible murder of Berta Cáceres, the Lenker leader, an environmental and Indigenous rights defender who was shot dead in her home on March 2016 after standing up for the rights of her community against the construction of the Agua Zarca Dam. We noted, of course, that in this situation, there was strong connection to her death with business leaders. We also mentioned the report from 2018 of the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which focused on attacks against and the criminalization of Indigenous human rights defenders, particularly those arising in the context of large-scale projects involving extractive industries, agribusiness, infrastructure, dams, and logging. And we reflected on the available prevention and protection measures that the Special Rapporteur highlighted as in need of further use and strengthening. So we highlighted the specific concerns relating to Indigenous defenders. And we note in our guidance that if followed, the guiding principles mean that risks of business-related human rights abuses do not escalate into actual harm and can be remediated before damage is done. Conflict often develops because of a lack of initial constructive engagement with defenders and communities and a failure to adopt a preventative approach to managing human rights risks. Protecting and respecting human rights defenders is not an option, but an obligation for states and for business enterprises, respectively. And therefore, the most wise, forward-thinking, and effective companies will view human rights defenders as partners. They will engage with them early and often in a spirit of dignity and respect, and they will engage respecting the principles of free, prior, and informed consent. Now, strengthening the protection of human rights defenders in the guidance looks at all three pillars of the guiding principles. Under Pillar 1, we emphasize again the role of states. So not only host states where a company may be operating, where the harm occurs, but home states, the states where companies are headquartered, and they have a responsibility to ensure that their companies are not connected to risks to Indigenous defenders. This is very important, and it can involve both incentives and penalties, as we outline in the recommendations. So providing guidance to companies on the importance of human rights defenders and Indigenous communities as key partners and stakeholders to be consulted is an important piece. But it's also important that governments also hold companies to account if they are implicated in harm to defenders. Canada, through its Voices at Risk program, for example, states that companies may lose their trade support, so different kinds of trade support and finance, if they are seen in any way to be connected to harm to defenders. Again, this is just a policy that we have to see in practice, but it's an example of how states can take more clear action. Secondly, businesses under Pillar 2 need to respect the rights of Indigenous and human rights defenders. This can be in different ways. The most important, of course, is early engagement and consultation. It's not enough for a business to think it knows what the human rights problems are. It must consult and understand from the community or individual perspective what the rights impacts are, and then change their business model accordingly. It's also important for human rights due diligence to actually predict specific risks to defenders. As we say to companies very often, one business, the multinational, may not be the one that is directly responsible for the harm to a defender. It may be a local government. It may be the local security or police force. It may be a partner company, a local affiliate. But if we think about the entire business relationship, the parent company still has a responsibility for all of its business relationships. So it must use human rights due diligence as a way of thinking about what risks may occur to defenders because of a business project, whether it's a dam or a factory. What kinds of risks may a defender face, and what steps can the company take to prevent that harm on the ground? This is very important. And finally, access to remedy. It is very important, and this is really where we have much work to be done, that states ensure that defenders have meaningful access to judicial remedy, to courts. Right now, we see the opposite through criminalization, as well as through strategic litigation against defenders. We have seen attempts to silence defenders and to remove their ability to go to court. They are punished for exercising their legal right. This needs to end. We also emphasize that when it comes to serious risks to a defender's life, that access to remedy means that companies need to think very seriously about what kind of remedy mechanisms they can offer that will be safe and secure to defenders. Now, we hope the guidance will become a living document that can be used as a tool to advocate, and we stand ready to work with you to do this because this is important as a priority. Strengthening the protection of human rights defenders, including Indigenous defenders, is a key priority for the next decade of the Business and Human Rights Agenda, and we will emphasize that in our roadmap for the next decade. While we have just celebrated 10 years of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, while we have some progress, we also note that the risk to defenders continues to grow. Therefore, we all need to act, and the working group stands ready to step with you on this journey. Thank you.
Так, мы прослушали
Well,
выступление.
we have listened to Anita, who unfortunately couldn't join us on live, but we heard very important Anita's words, especially relating to roadmap and inclusion of Indigenous peoples, human rights defendants in this document. As we can see from the speeches of our today's speakers, this issue is of great importance and is very relevant to Indigenous peoples, and it's very good that the working group has decided to include this issue and in the roadmap. So I would like to give the floor to our next speaker, our brother, Francisco Kalisto, with whom we worked a lot together and who's doing a lot for the protection of the rights of Indigenous peoples. Today, Francisco Kalisto is a special rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous peoples. He was the founder and member of different Indigenous organizations in Guatemala, and he's also former president of the Committee for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. The floor is yours, Francisco.
Thank you very much, Pavel. It's a very honor to see you and to share this forum with you as our coordinator, and it's a great honor and privilege to share this work in this meeting to reflect on the lessons learned and gaps identified during the first decade of the UN Guiding Principle on Business and Human Rights, and to offer some recommendation to chart off a course of for action in the decade ahead. The thematic report on the impact of COVID-19 on indigenous people that I just presented and I ended today to the Human Rights Council highlights the COVID-19 has exacerbated the disproportionate impact of large-scale extractive and agribusiness activities on indigenous territories. And according to the information that I received from indigenous peoples and NGOs during the COVID pandemic, governments have prioritized extractive industries and agricultural development on the ancestral land of indigenous people to promote economic recovery. States have used the COVID-19 health crisis to approve projects and policies without the free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous peoples. Additionally, states have reduced penalties for environmental violation, criminalized indigenous human rights defenders, and removed requirements for environmental impact assessment. 10 years after the UN Guiding Principle on Business on Human Rights were endorsed, indigenous people are still suffering a disproportionate impact from the development of large-scale projects in their territories. We need to remind that since 2007, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples has been the minimum guiding standard for the right of indigenous peoples. For issues affecting their land territories and resources, it is just to mention Article 3 of the declaration that recognizes that indigenous people have the right of self-determination. In Article 25 and 26, that recognize the right of the land and territories and resources that they have traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used or acquired. Article 29 established that indigenous people have the right to the conservation and protection of environment and the productive capacity of their land and territories and resources. Finally, Article 32 recognizes the right to free, prior, and informed consent prior to the approval of any project affecting their land or territory and other resources. Bearing in mind the declaration and based on my experience as a Special Rapporteur on the right of indigenous peoples, I wish to share with you some recommendations I have for a state and businesses. A state must strengthen and respect the indigenous right to self-determination and the right to land and resources. A state should adopt a legal framework to guarantee the demarcation and complete indigenous control over their traditional territories and adopt effective implementation measures. 2, a state shall consult and cooperate in good faith with indigenous people to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent before adopting and implementing laws, plans, and activities related to businesses and development. A state shall also guarantee the full participation of indigenous women in any consultation process. 3rd, a state shall adopt measures to prevent the killing, threat, and other forms of violence, including the criminalization of indigenous people defending their lands and environment in the context of business activities. Concerning businesses, first, human rights due diligence requires that business enterprises employ participatory human rights impact assessment. Second, businesses must respect indigenous right to free, prior, and informed consent. Companies must be aware of indigenous legal system, indigenous decision-making processes, and respect indigenous governance and customary law. Third, in case of consolidation between indigenous communities and the private sector, a state need to ensure measures to oversee and evaluate procedure undertaken by businesses enterprises. 4, my predecessor, Victoria Tauri Corpus, in her thematic report on impact of international investment and free trade on the human right and on human rights of indigenous people, recommended that international investment agreement address the corporate responsibility to respect human rights.
Concerning the victims' access to an effective remedy, first, the state and the private sectors have to guarantee effective and adequate guidance mechanisms to enforce free, prior, and informed consent, and to obtain redress for the harm caused to indigenous people by business operation. Second, the state must offer adequate mechanisms, extraterritorial regulations to make transnational corporations accountable for gross violation of indigenous human rights. Third, the state must offer effective judicial mechanism and legal support to address the imbalance of power between business enterprises and indigenous peoples regarding indigenous people access to justice. In particular, the state must address the structural racism and racial discrimination that indigenous people face in the justice system due to the cultural inadequacy of justice procedure, language barriers, the cost of access to justice. Fourth, the state court must apply the indigenous human rights framework in dispute concerning the development of business operation in the ancestral territories and guarantee the decisions are being enforced. Finally, the arbitration tribunal should also be accessible to indigenous people and bound in their decision by the relevant international human rights standard, including the United Nations Declaration for Rights of Indigenous People and the International Labour Organization Convention 169. To conclude, the years after the UN guiding principle on business and human rights were endorsed, indigenous people are still suffering a disproportionate impact from the development of large-scale projects in their territories. In some cases, these activities can even threaten their physical and cultural survival. For this reason, I welcome the Working Group on Business and Human Rights initiative to take advantage of the 10th anniversary to make an overall assessment of UN guiding principle on business and human rights implementation and chart a course for action in the decade ahead. This new course of action shall be built upon the experiences and recommendations of indigenous people, and for this reason, the finding and recommendation of the report, the UN guiding principle on business and human rights and indigenous people are of paramount importance. Thank you very much.
Спасибо большое,
Thank you very much, Francisco, for your recommendations, for your advice, and for the work you conduct. And now I would like to give the floor to our next speaker, Benito Kalisto, who is Vice President of IPRI, Expert Mechanisms on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Benito is well-known activist, human rights activist from Bangladesh. Benito, the floor is yours.
Kolumka Hambai, thank you, Pavel. Good evening, good morning, and good afternoon, wherever you are now. Distinguished experts, delegates, guests, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, I'd like to thank you to the organizer, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Denmark, IPRI, and Indigenous Peoples' Rights International for having me to this event today. It is an honor and pleasure and also privileges to be with the experts. Regarding your suggestion, because of the MRIP, as you are expecting to share something, what we do as a mechanism. MRIP mandate is to provide the Human Rights Council with expertise and advice on the rights of indigenous peoples, as set out in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and assist member states upon request in achieving the ends of the declaration through the promotion, protection, and fulfillment of the rights of indigenous peoples. So the opportunity we also do, we address the issue of respect and protection of indigenous peoples' rights in general, and also whenever it is associated with the context of business activities. and impacting to indigenous people's rights. One is through reporting with advice to the Human Rights Council, and the other is through the country engagement according to the mandate. The country engagement is in identifying the need for and providing technical advice regarding the development of domestic legislation and policies relating to the rights of indigenous peoples. And currently we have engaged with some countries based on the country needs and aspirations like New Zealand, Finland, we are in Mexico, and we're in the process of Japan and Brazil, and to name a few. So in our study advised, one of the most important elements, the central element actually, is the right to self-determination as the overarching rights. We have always been demonstrated in our study and advice. And we also think that this is not only recognized in Article 3 as the self-determination rights, but also this manifested in Article 4, 5, Article 18, 19, 20, and 33 of the Declaration when we talk about the achievement, or when we talk about the achievement at the end of the right to self-determination. So without Article 3, the rights of self-determination, and none of the rights can be fulfilled. When I say Article 4 of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, this is about autonomous or self-governing mechanisms and to ensure that indigenous peoples have means for financing their autonomous functions. So, ladies and gentlemen, as this discussion is in relation to business activities, what brings in my mind is the right to self-determination and the free, fair, and informed consent in line with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as it is our mandate, the IPRI. And also I'd like to elaborate a bit more about the FPIC that IPRI carried out in 2018. IPRI study findings in business impacts largely that the free, prior, and informed consent has not been adequately addressed in conducting business activities over indigenous people's land and territories. Indigenous people's views, the process of seeking free, prior, and informed consent is at times viewed as merely procedural in nature rather than focused on human rights. The procedural nature sometimes seen as a goodwill gesture to indigenous peoples and can lead to serving third-party interests rather than protecting their rights holder interest. In relation to business activities over indigenous peoples' land and territory, IPRI land rights study last year finds the rise in conflict on indigenous lands due to destruction, encroachment, and land grabbing, and a commensurate rise in the criminalization and harassment of and violence against defenders of indigenous lands are related to the business of the corporation, sometimes a state agency. For example, for the state agency case, military corporate associated with the hotel and tourism business over indigenous people's land and territory. Such example we see in the Chittagong Hill Tracts of Bangladesh. However, FPIC that I am talking about, free, prior, informed consent, should be the fundamental foundation for any activities, as this has internationally recognized legal norms and as recognized it is human rights. Most importantly, in line with the right to self-determination, free, prior, and informed consent that this implies, the states have a duty to obtain indigenous people's consent in relation to decisions that are of fundamental importance for their rights, survival, dignity, and well-being. When saying so, states should ensure the consultations and negotiations with indigenous peoples are carried out with their representatives, which should also comply with human rights standards as set out in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. What I'd like to conclude, before concluding, I'd like to share in some points in line with Rugi's guiding principle, protect, respect, and remedy, endorsed by the Human Rights Council Resolution 17/4 on 16 June 2011. One is that any business or corporate activities taking place over the indigenous people's land and territory. What is important is that states should engage directly with indigenous peoples. When direct negotiations between indigenous peoples and private enterprises are sought by indigenous peoples themselves. Companies then must exercise due diligence to ensure the adequacy of consultation procedures. Also, the states remain responsible for any inadequacy and shall ensure measures are in place to oversee and evaluate procedures undertaken by business enterprises, which could include legislation or guidelines requiring the operationalization of free, prior, and informed consent, and penalizing corporations for failing to comply with such consent. Also, is that the states should establish preconditions for achieving effective free, prior, and informed consent, including building trust, good faith, culturally appropriate methods of negotiation and recognition, and respect for indigenous peoples' inherent rights. The process should be formal and carried out with mutual respect. So I'll stop here. Thank you once again for this opportunity. Back to you, Pavel.
Спасибо, спасибо большое, Бенота.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Benota. All the speakers have
Thank you very much,
given us
Benota.
their
And
presentation,
now
so we are moving on to the discussion,
questions and answers.
to the questions. Together with Lola, we're going to be moderators of this part of the discussion. If you want to take the floor or to ask a question, you can use the chat box, or you can use the raise your hand function, and we will give you the floor. And also we can address the questions to the speakers if you notify whom you address your question to. So does anyone want to take the floor?
Yeah, we have already two hands. I would say that we have not so much time so we will take 4 questions. I think we have some time for around 4 questions. And if you have further questions, please do not hesitate to send it to us, or asking if they are addressed to a specific panelist, and we will try to address your question in writing. But at the moment, I can see that we have 3 hands. I don't know in which order they were raised, but I will give the floor now to Dalton Pakashapuruanga. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name right, but please be very brief because we don't have much time. Please, Dalton, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. I hope I can be heard. The name is Dalton Bakashabaruhanga. Yes, I know it's long. Many people usually don't get it, but my question is addressed to all panelists. And I know that the discussion we are having right now affects not only the countries from which, those panelists come from. The same issue affects Uganda right now. I'm in Uganda. I work for the Uganda Consortium on Corporate Accountability. And often in our work, we do experience situations where you go to communities and sometimes indigenous communities, and there are all these projects going on. And particularly, I want to point to a project which is funded by the African Development Bank that is currently taking place in a certain area called Pakwach in northwestern Uganda. And this project funded by the African Development Bank is an agricultural project. Now, what they did is they came to the people, told them, we are bringing you this and that sort of development. We are going to take your land, but then at the end of the day, it is going to be for your own benefit. At the stage we are at, they haven't started implementation of the project. They were at the stage of acquisition, of land acquisition in order to start carrying out the project. So we have oftentimes insisted on government and the project implementers using the principle of free, prior, and informed consent. Of course, as of now, Uganda is one of the, I think, few countries, if not the only country in Africa, that has right now adopted we have now a national action plan on business and human rights. And I think it's the only country in Africa. Even in its presence, people do not really care. And of course, with the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, that sort of, is similar to the UNGPs, as we have been discussing them, we feel like it's not enough. And this is why we oftentimes encourage the principle of free, prior, and informed consent. But every time we encourage this, it's not really taken. It's because they keep saying it's not within our laws, it's just a principle, and it works for indigenous, cultures. And they want you to explain who these indigenous people are. They actually seem to say that in Uganda, we do not have any indigenous persons. Maybe a proper and clearer understanding of who these indigenous people are, because as this project is going on, it's called the Wadela Irrigation Project in the northwestern part of Uganda. As it's going on and as we are trying to encourage free, prior, and informed consent, government and the project implementers are actually not taking it up.
Sorry, Dalton, can you finalize, because we don't have much time. Can you finalize your question to the panelists?
Yeah, okay. So my question is, I want to understand more. What do they mean by indigenous? What do they mean by indigenous?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dalton. I asked the panelists perhaps to take note, and we move to the second question from the audience, so you can perhaps later on respond to them. We have four persons that would like to raise a question, but now is Benito Kalisto Guzman. Please, Benito, you take the floor.
Buenos días con todos.
Good morning, ladies, gentlemen. I would first like to thank the organizers of this important webinar. It's true that in a very complex situation that we are living as Indigenous peoples, you know that we are suffering from the pandemic, and we are going through a huge global environmental crisis that concerns the Amazon and Andean peoples that I represent. And we are also in a moral crisis where there's incarceration, persecution, murders of the defenders of Mother Earth. My question is very specific. After 10 years of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, we would like to hear from the panelists if the outcome has been positive or negative, and to say firmly that from the UN we need to be much more direct for the defense and protection of the rights of Indigenous peoples, because we see that these rights are abused every day. We are protected by Convention 169. Certain countries are implementing it, but our rights are abused every day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Benito. I think before I gave the floor to the next, I don't know if somebody wants to address the question by Dalton about the term or the concept of Indigenous peoples. Very quick, because we don't have much time. And the issue of raised by Benito, it's more than a question, it's an assessment, but the need for the UN to be more direct, more strong, more decisive about the defense of indigenous people's rights, and particularly, of course, the indigenous people's rights defenders. So I don't know who from the panelists would like to make a short comment or a response of those two questions.
If you allow me, Lola, I'm just going to give you some general answer, please.
Go ahead, Francisco.
No, to Dalton, there is not any definition for indigenous people, because that is the main problem that we had in the 80s, in the 90s, when we were discussing the Declaration of Indigenous Peoples' Rights. And that was very smart not to have a very close definition of indigenous peoples. Indigenous, in general, are those people who were living in a territory before the colonizer got into those territories. And those people that are speaking the same language, they have the same culture, and they share customs and territories, and they define themselves as indigenous peoples, but also the person who belongs to that indigenous people had to be accepted by the community. That is a general definition. But in Africa, there is a big problem, because on those years and until today, also in Asia, that government, state doesn't recognize the existence of indigenous people. Some of them, they have been making a step ahead, and they have been recognizing indigenous people, like Nepal. They have even in their constitution the recognition of indigenous people. But still, there are discussions that are going to come. But I think that Dalton, if you and your people, you define yourself as indigenous people, that is enough for the system of United Nations.
Any comment, Francisco or Benito, about this? Can the UN be more strong, more direct, more firm about the defense of indigenous people's rights and the protection of indigenous rights defenders, in line with what Kalisto, Benito Kalisto has mentioned?
Can I just join very briefly to this point? Well, one thing is, what is the United Nations? This is the club of the member states. And they are the one taking all the decisions, whatever it is required or needed or appropriate. And sometimes the politics is so complex. We feel sometimes we are in the geopolitical trap as indigenous peoples. That's my personal view. I'm not sharing here as an EMRI member, but from my personal perspective, this is what the observation we see every time when it comes for the human rights and also for the indigenous people's rights. As Special Rapporteur has just mentioned, the challenges, also the recognition issue, how it flows every time. Most of the states, why they don't want to recognize indigenous peoples as indigenous peoples, this is basically the rights that have already internationally recognized. They are afraid that they have to respect those rights at a domestic level once they recognize the indigenous peoples as indigenous peoples. And that's they feel trapped in various perspectives. So there's one thing, and what I will just say that one thing is, of course, the engagement we are involved in this process, the collective approach to see more how we positively can approach and endorse the government. And also at the same time, reminding them their commitment, the obligations towards the human rights, disrespect, protect, fulfill, that they made in the United Nations and internationally. So I think there's the only way we have to engage through the channels, through the process, and through the mechanisms, applying those instruments. I only see this area. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Benito. And I think we continue. We have only time for 2 more questions, and I have more people asking, but I think now I will give the floor to Patricia Borràs to raise the question, and the next one will be Arturo Requesens. So, and we will close for the final remarks from Joan Carlin. So please, Patricia, go ahead. Patricia, are you there? Can you hear us? We cannot hear you. Okay, while we wait for Patricia, perhaps Arturo, can you go ahead and Patricia can come later.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can.
Well, first of all, congratulations to all of you. I don't want to take a lot of time. Thanking all of you for this very interesting panel and for all the ideas shared, and we totally agree with them. I just wanted to ask whether a panelist might be able to share with us something that could be considered as a good practice on the implementation on the guiding principles of business and human rights in their engagement with indigenous peoples. That's my concrete question. Thank you so much, Lola, for organizing this very interesting meeting.
Thank you very much, Arturo. And Patricia, are you there? No?
She didn't ask the floor.
She just put on the chat that she didn't ask for the floor.
Okay, I could see the hand in the list. Anyhow, doesn't matter. I think as we don't have much time, I think we end with Arturo's question to the panelists. Is there any best practice on the implementation of the UN guiding principles in the context of indigenous peoples?
Well, I think that if there is one, I will be very happy to share with you. Unfortunately, all the reports that I have been receiving are not respecting the human rights of indigenous people, unfortunately. And as I was telling the state, I am here not only to criticize the state or private sectors, but the thing is that still I am waiting to find one and really I will be very happy to publicize and to share with everybody that that practice. I have not have any example in this moment, unfortunately, on that issue. And so I just take this opportunity to thank you, Lola, IPRI, and also all the organizers for this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to you, Francisco. So I think we don't have much more time.
Lola, I'll just.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Just to jump on a little. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this, as Francisco said, actually, I also don't see any good example that can be shared. The good practices on the implementation of Ruby's principle. But definitely, this is the one also that has brought a significant attention in many ways to respect the indigenous people's rights and also the IPRI process. Now, what I can share with you and information is that, you know, as I shared, AMRIF has a country engagement. Now we have recently received an invitation from one of the New Zealand business group. So I'm not sure what kind of I have read, but we have to see this also further. I don't know whether it could be in the future, we can set something good example in relation to this guiding principle implementation. But let's hope the best. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Benito and Francisco, for your responses and the issue of identifying best practices. But even if there are some best practices that they are out there, what is really clear is most of them are bad practices, or at least not good practices. So there is a need to move, to really make the UN guiding principles, to put them really into practice. I mean, if there is a next decade of implementation, I think much more effort and really much more it's needed a much stronger commitment from states and of course private sector to really put those words into practice. But with this, I think we go to the final remarks from Joan Carling, and Joan Carling is the Executive Director of IPRI. So please, Joan, go ahead with your final remarks. And after Joan's final remarks, we will present a video on the UN guiding principles to close the event. Thank you very much. Joan, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Lola, and also thank you to all the panelists. I just want to quickly add to the question if there are good practice that has emerged from the implementation of the UN guiding principles. I think there are significant advances in relation to policy level with regards to a set of business. For example, we have the one on mining, the ICMM developing their IP policy, which includes the requirement for free, prior, and informed consent. Of course, this is voluntary, right? And we also have the Equator principles, which also upholds free, prior, and informed consent. This is a group of banks and investors. We also have the Investors Alliance for Human Rights, which is also recognizing the rights of indigenous peoples, and this has been also the result, of course, of a strong pressure from human rights movements, organizations, including indigenous peoples, that there is this trend. And we now also see the European Union already coming out with their law on human rights due diligence for European companies. So I think that is also partly a contribution of the implementation of the UN guiding principles for a decade. But as all of you have mentioned, there's a huge gap, right? And in certain places, there's even a rollback, as Rica has mentioned. And that is something that we really need to address. And looking back to this session where we actually really planned this event as a side event for the Human Rights Council, particularly in relation to their work on indigenous peoples, where they are coming out with resolutions, with a set of resolutions pertaining to indigenous peoples. It is really important for the Human Rights Council to stress the need for states and companies to strengthen the implementation of the UN guiding principles with the respect, protect, and remedy in the next decade, to make it relevant or for it to really advance or improve the situation or condition of indigenous peoples. We've seen the recommendations already mentioned by our special rapporteur, both from the past and present special rapporteur, and these are still very, very important for the Human Rights Council to support in pushing for greater accountability of states and companies in relation to indigenous peoples. One of the urgent need among the three pillars is really the issue of access to justice, and that is still the weakest part of the implementation of the guiding principles. So we hope and we need to push that in the next decade of implementation, that should really be given special attention, especially relating to access to justice of indigenous peoples. And that will only come about if there is also a strong legal recognition of indigenous peoples. As others have pointed out, how can we have access to justice when our rights are not recognized and we are ending up criminalized? So we need to look at also the interrelations of the three pillars and ensure that we are not just talking of corporate responsibility, but corporate accountability. And that should be the emphasis on the three pillars. So in moving forward, IPRI, the Indigenous Peoples' Rights International, is now coordinating and taking some leading role in, sorry, my throat, I'll just get water. Sorry. First is on raising awareness on this issue, because a lot of indigenous communities and organizations are still not aware of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. We actually is going to, we will issue a practical guide for indigenous people's engagement, and also an awareness raising material like the video that will be shown later. We will be doing some case studies, especially recent cases, to demonstrate how bad the situation is or the gaps that needs to be addressed, and also what are the emerging good practice in relation to the three pillars. So that will be, of course, we will do this with organizations, indigenous organizations working on the ground and who wants to be part of or collaborate in terms of doing sustained advocacy and engagement on this issue of business and human rights for indigenous peoples. And then we also intend to do series of meetings in terms of us developing our own roadmap on pushing for or the strengthening of the implementation of the UN guiding principles. And because that is really also what we can do. We need to push, we need to strengthen our cooperation, our collaboration on how do we engage with mining companies that are operating in different parts. How are we going to engage with agribusiness that are all over the place? And how do we also push for the recognition of the community protocols on free, prior, and informed consent? How can we exchange experiences and lessons learned in our engagement with business? So it's important that we also have our own roadmap so that we can sustain our engagement in pushing for greater accountability of states and corporations in respecting and protecting the rights of indigenous peoples. And in doing so, we will need to also collaborate and work with advocates and human rights organizations that are working on business, because we need to also broaden our linkages for a stronger cooperation, and finally also work in a more sustained manner on the issue of the development of a treaty, a legally binding treaty on corporations, which is another mechanism that can push for greater accountability of corporations. At the moment, like I mentioned, the EU is developing its law, and that is an important avenue for us also to engage, to ensure that there is explicit reference to the respect and protection of indigenous people's rights and the requirement for free, prior, and informed consent, and that the law will cover the whole value chain of businesses that are involved or are affecting indigenous peoples. So these are some of the plans that we have in moving forward, but I just want to emphasize that the need for us to work together on this issue, and we've heard from the the working group, from the Special Rapporteur, and from MRIP, their strong commitment to be with us in pushing for a stronger implementation of the UN guiding principles that is fully anchored in the implementation as well of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So with this, we need to further strengthen our collaboration, and also with the, of course, with the working group. And just to mention that IPRI, the Indigenous Peoples Rights International, is of course open to work with different organizations. We are of course now having this strong collaboration with IFGIA and also with other organizations on this work. So hopefully this discussion, this is not the end of this event. We want to get in touch with you on how we can move this forward. And finally, I would just like to acknowledge again the contributions of all the different mechanisms. As I said, we'll definitely be working closely with our Special Rapporteur, Francisco Cali. Thanks for being with us here, with Benito, with all the members of the MRIP, also with the UN Working Group on business and human rights, and also of course with the Permanent Forum and other relevant actors. And yes, so we hope that as we move along in developing our own roadmap in the next decade, there will be more of us working together on this issue so that we can finally push for a stronger implementation, and that Indigenous people's rights will be at the center of the recognition and respect of business and states. So with that, thank you to all the participants. Thank you, Lola. Thank you, Pavel. Thank you to all my colleagues here. And also thank you to all our interpreters. And I would also just like to acknowledge that actually Pavel is in our board. Also Ruka is in our board, and Lars Anders Bear is also with us. He's also in our board. And so you can see that IPRI is very much engaged on this issue. So thanks to all, and good evening, good morning, and good day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanne. And I think it's not much to say that. I join Joanne in thanking everybody, all the participants, of course, that have joined us, and the panelists, of course, and the interpreters, and my fellow organizers, IPRI, everybody who has made possible to have this event today. And we will finalize showing this video about the UN Guiding Principles on Indigenous Peoples, but I would like to show the seminar, the webinar will continue showing the video, and when the video is finished, the meeting will be closed. Thank you very much to all.
Indigenous Peoples and the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Indigenous peoples' lands, territories and resources are often regarded by the dominant states and businesses as a resource that can simply be taken and exploited.
Traditional Sami lands, they are considered state property.
As Indigenous peoples defend their rights, they are criminalized, marginalized and abused. To address these and other human rights abuses and violations, in June 2011, the United Nations adopted the Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. This is the UNGP. Business can create jobs, growth and infrastructure, but can also engage in corruption, pollution and human rights violations. So it is important to implement the guiding principles to ensure businesses respect human rights. The UNGP is a framework applicable to states and businesses. It clarifies their duties and responsibilities in relation to human rights when doing business. These apply to all states and to all business enterprises, both small and large, local and international. The UNGP consists of 3 pillars: protect, respect, remedy. Protect. The state's duty is to protect against human rights abuses. Respect. Business shall respect and avoid infringing human rights.
Business entities, they should make sure that UNGP should be implemented to make sure that indigenous people's right is not violated.
Remedy. States and businesses should ensure access to effective remedies for rights violations. Supporting the UNGP. The UNGP is overseen by the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. Their mandate is to promote the UNGP, identify good practices, make recommendations for effective remedies, monitor alleged human rights abuses and intervene if necessary, and importantly, guide the UN Forum on Business and Human Rights. The UN Forum on Business and Human Rights is an annual 3-day event. It serves as a global platform for stakeholders to discuss trends and challenges and promote dialogue and cooperation on issues linked to business and human rights. The participation of indigenous peoples within the forum enables them to advocate for the inclusion of the collective rights enshrined in the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP.
И могу сказать, что форум, который проводится ежегодно,
I can say that the forum that takes place annually is the Global Forum on Indigenous Peoples is very important for us, for the voice of indigenous peoples to be heard.
The forum enables them to raise awareness on the human rights abuses and violations committed against them, to advance and develop a common position and recommendations, engage directly with members of the working group, network and strengthen solidarity with NGOs and other allies, engage with financial institutions, businesses and states and other relevant actors. It is fundamental that indigenous peoples engage at the different levels: international, regional and national. Implementing the UNGP, National Action Plans, NAP. These should be developed through a multi-stakeholder platform including indigenous peoples. An NAP should include commitments by the states on how business will be regulated and how the 3 pillars will be implemented. A decade of UNGP implementation. After 10 years of the UNGP, challenges still remain as the rights of indigenous peoples continue to be ignored and violated by states and businesses.
For example, on the Norwegian side, there is the Fosen wind power plant, which is, I believe, the biggest wind power park in Europe, and that is built on traditional Sami territories and without consent.
There are some good experience, but there are some not so good experiences on these mines. We want people here have a job, but they don't actually do that. And there's also a lot of environmental issues.
The NAPs in many countries missed the opportunity to address wide-scale violation of human rights, as well as developing policies to implement the standards enshrined in UNDRIP. This includes free, prior and informed consent, FPIC, and the recognition of customary justice systems as part of the remedy pillar.
Nuestros territorios y bosques son vida.
Our territories and forests are life, not merchandise. Indigenous peoples have insisted that our territory is not for sale. Businesses must comply with their due diligence and respect our rights to free, prior and informed consent. Likewise, they must comply with international human rights standards in all their activities, including their supply chain.
However, progress has been made that benefits Indigenous peoples, including voluntary due diligence by businesses, an increase of NAPs with the participation of Indigenous peoples, raised awareness and attention to human rights abuses. There are examples proving that collaboration can work. In Australia, a participation agreement was created between Argyle Diamonds and the Miriwong, Gija, Malning and Woolnar peoples on whose lands an Argyle mine sits. In the Arctic, the Sami people successfully campaigned to have Stora Enso, a multinational paper company, change its wood procurement practices.
Companies often want to maintain some kind of image of being respectful towards human rights, towards indigenous people's rights, environmental standards, and so on. Nowadays, that social media can be used to very effectively to mobilize a lot of attention.
Regional and national progress has been seen in Latin American countries with the development of FPIC protocols and judiciary decisions related to human rights abuses by businesses. But it remains a very dangerous environment for human rights defenders. What do Indigenous peoples want over the next 10 years?
What we envision in the next decade of UNGP implementation, a change in the behavior of companies and governments in engaging with Indigenous peoples based on the respect for our rights, our dignity, and our roles as stewards of nature. And we need effective mechanisms for states and companies to be accountable to their human rights obligations. We need states to adopt a legally binding treaty for business to respect human rights as an urgent concern.
There are differences between the hopes related to states, business, and among Indigenous peoples themselves, but there are fundamentals that form the foundation of the cooperation required to achieve a sustainable balance between business, human rights, and Indigenous peoples. So what is it that Indigenous peoples are hoping for? Integration of the UNDRIP in the UNGP implementation, including the proper application of FPIC. Recognise, respect and support community-driven FPIC protocols and guidelines when engaging with Indigenous peoples. Establish effective mechanisms for Indigenous peoples' access to remedy at project, national, regional and global levels, as well as the integration of Indigenous customary justice systems. Conduct outreach for awareness raising on the rights of Indigenous peoples and the UNGP. Establish effective mechanisms for the full and effective participation of Indigenous peoples at all levels, especially of women and youth.
Было бы очень важно, чтобы мы, старшее поколение, конечно же, уделяли больше внимания развитию и образованию молодежи, чтобы наша молодежь могла права своих народов на том же уровне, на котором делается и в рамках ООН, и в рамках.
Our greatest hope is for a just, equitable and sustainable world with respect for diversity and the dignity of all its people.